So, hey guys, listen, I got to be honest with you. After my first episode, the increase of emails, text messages, and messaging for a meatloaf recipe is out of control. So I just need you to understand that it was just Betty Crocker recipe, but I didn't know if people were inquiring about the shape or the recipe. But going forward, there's a lot of things I want to thank you for. I really do. I appreciate everybody, watching, participating, commenting. I didn't think it would be that important, and it really turned out to be something special. So it made me feel good, and I want to thank all of you for watching, and I hope you continue to watch, and hopefully we can do a lot more things. One of the things that I had actually been thinking about is today's episode, and I want to get into really the history of oysters. So one of the things that I was really contemplating was the hand-me-down. Like if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, shirts were handed down, like they would go to brother to brother to sister to brother, however it worked. Certain things were there. And there's a handyman. It's not really a hand-me-down story, but my grandfather, who actually has a plaque over at Bellport Middle School, he was the head custodian for years. And we thought it was cool. Every year, when I was in elementary school, at the end of the year, probably the last week of June, he'd bring home like a case of milk. We get school milk. You know how cool it is to drink school milk at the end of the school year. When you're not at school, it was awesome for us. So once I got to middle school, going from 6th to 7th grade, I'll never forget. It happened to be, I don't know if you want to call it the worst day of my life, but my grandfather brought home about 3 black trash bags. I swear to God, this is terrible. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, what are you doing here? And he's like, yeah, I got some stuff from school. I figured I'd do it. So we dump out the trash bags. I don't know if I should be saying this. It is the entire lost and found and everything found in the lockers from Bellport High School. So I'm like, what are we supposed to do with this? My grandfather goes, try it on. You don't have to buy clothes. Now, this is my grandfather's mentality, right? We're talking about the hand-me-down. He's looking at a valuable t-shirt. Why spend $10, $5, $3 on a t-shirt? You can do this. So I'm like, Pop, I can't do this. Like, you know what I'm saying? He's like, just put them on. My father goes, just put them on now. So lo and behold, they were never washed. I'm trying on all these sweaty, dirty shirts. To make it worse, some things fit, some things don't. The things that didn't fit were taken over to the thrift store and Goodwill and the church. The rest stayed in my living. Wait, this is where the story gets crazy. I'm walking through school one day, and this kid starts screaming at me how I stole his t-shirt. Right? Now, you have to kind of understand what's going on. I'm standing there. This guy is saying, that's my t-shirt. You stole my t-shirt. I didn't steal the t-shirt. But how do I turn around and kind of like live with this? Like, I can't turn around and say, oh no, my grandfather found it in a locker and I'm wearing it, right? I could never live down that reputation, or I was about to get beat up. And I guess the long story to it is that the principal, Mr. Wilner, interceded, and I got a day's worth of detention. And from that point, my grandfather never got me a hand-me-down again. So we look at these things, a dog, right? From the pound, the dog is, returned, not wanted. And then you take the dog and it's this wonderful, warm, happy dog, right? Hand-me-downs are something that I think are valued based on what we do. And that's stories with the family. It really is. Like when you look at this, what is your family offering you? What's your family history? Do you know where your grandparents or your great-grandparents are buried? Do you know the stories behind these things? And guys, it's one of the things that I'm trying to push here. The Long Island Shucking Truck is really geared to making family events. That's our goal. I tell people all the time when I get picked for a wedding, in 40 years from now, I'm not going to be here. If I am, oh my God. But in 40 years, somebody's going to remember the Raw Bar. In 40 years, they're going to remember the most important days of their lives up to that very moment. And it's why my repeat business is so, so positive. Because why? I walk in there believing that we're family. I'm going to treat you like you were my brother, my mom, anybody else. That's the way we're going to handle this. So as I continue to look at hand-me-downs, I keep thinking about the history of everything, the history of oysters. And the history of oysters is complex, simple in one breath and very complex in the other. There's many different types of oysters. There's an Atlantic or an Eastern oyster. There's a Pacific oyster. There's a European oyster. And I want to concentrate, since we're on Long Island, of really, believe it or not, the quintessential, what we call the Blue Point oyster. And the Blue Point oyster has an unbelievable history. And it is pretty much the most pirated name for any oyster in the United States. Blue Point oysters only come from one location, and it's really from Patchogue to Bayshore. And it's so regulated by the state. It really is. Like, the state only gives X amount of permits, I guess you would want to call them, licenses to farm the Blue Point oyster in the Great South Bay. So if you get some Blue Point oyster, it's not the case. The Blue Point is about a body of water. And it's about, when you get into the flavor palettes of oysters, it's about mineral taste, the brininess, what it brings to the table. So when you start to get into oysters and we really start looking at them, that's it. Now, today, I got my first guest. I'm so excited. I brought a gentleman along who's going to help me out. He's very knowledgeable of this. I've had a conversation with him about this, and it's Justin from the Long Island Maritime Museum in West Sayville. Now, if you haven't been there, I actually did a wedding there. It's a beautiful facility. Oh my God. I mean, it's kind of like old romance, if you want to talk about that. It's adorned with like museums and historical features, boats, things of that nature. So it's really pretty incredible. So I'd like to introduce Justin. I want him to talk about the museum today. I want him to talk about his knowledge of the Blue Point oyster. I mean, I would tell you this is the first layer of the onion, because as we get deeper and deeper into this, I want to bring you really the excitement of oysters. People just think they're a little like, ew, unless you love them. And then they're like, oh my God, I love them. But there's a lot to the oyster, and it's more than meets the eye. Like, it's not just a delicacy. There's a balance between the environment, about an industry, about food. They're really an important little creature, and they're an impressive little creature. So I'd like to turn it over to Justin, if possible. And Justin's here. So Justin, thank you for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ralph. So thanks for the little intro there. Like you said, I'm coming from the Long Island Maritime Museum over in West Sayville. I'm the volunteer and visitor services coordinator. So I oversee all our volunteers. I organize our tours. I'm involved in a lot of our education programs and whatever else has to get done. We're a small team over there, so everybody does a little bit of everything. But yeah, to start getting into oysters, so we have some displays on the oyster industry. Mainly, we have our William Rudolph oyster packing house or oyster processing house as one of our exhibits. The building was built in 1908 and donated to us, the museum, in 1974. And the exhibits in there are all about the oyster industry, the rise and fall of it. So starting out, I want to zoom out a little bit, just talk about the oysters themselves. So like you said, they are a unique creature, really important for the environment. So an oyster is what's called a bivalve. So any mollusks or shellfish that have two shells. So clams, oysters, mussels, scallops, those are all your bivalves. And
all the good eating things.
Yeah. And so they're all filter feeders, meaning that they pull water into themselves. They filter out the nutrients that they need from the water, from microorganisms in it and from other suspended elements, and then release any waste and the rest of the water that they're not using. And that, of course, is filtering the water, making it cleaner for other things in that marine ecosystem. And oysters are the best at this out of any of them. So an adult oyster will filter about 4 gallons of water every hour. They do about 50 gallons of water every single day.
Impressive.
Mm-hmm. And that's obviously per oyster, hundreds, thousands of oysters in an oyster bed. And they're also, talking about those oyster beds, really important for the environment as oyster reefs. So the oyster shell itself actually provides a lot of habitat for other marine animals, algae, worms, snails, anything like that, and helps increase that biodiversity in an area. So in terms of actual tangible increases, you compare sandy bottom seafloor to an oyster bed, it's about 50 times the surface area of an equal amount of space.
Really?
Yeah. So just a ton more space for all of these little organisms to get in and to live. So it's really important having them in these waters. And we used to have them all over, whether you're talking about the South Shore, in the Great South Bay with the Blue Points. New York Harbor used to be full of oysters as well. That's kind of the genesis of the industry here. So going back, hundreds of years before colonization in the area, you see the indigenous people in this area, oyster is one of the main food sources they were relying on. This harvesting goes back centuries and centuries, whether you're talking about Lenape in New York or Unkachug and Montaukett and Setauket and all of the groups that make up Long Island. They're all relying very heavily on oysters. So you start getting immigration, Dutch and English, into the area, especially in New York City. They start engaging in this oyster industry as well. And I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Those New York beds start dying off, and attention comes to those the oyster beds, on the South Shore in the Great South Bay.
So why did the oysters start dying off in the city? What was the real...
Mainly overharvesting in that period, just a much bigger population. So similar to the effects that we'll talk about in a little bit that happen here, but there's a big spread of environmental factors that play into the decline of the oyster in the South Bay eventually. New York Harbor, mostly just overharvesting, and they weren't as abundant beds as the ones that you see on the South Shore here. And so they couldn't really keep up with demand. And you think about the population of New York, even at that time when we're talking 1700s, 1800s, it's obviously nowhere near what it is today, but
Sure.
Still much bigger population than we're seeing out on the island at a given time.
Well, yeah, it's true. New York City really was the oyster capital of the I don't know if you want to call it the New World at that point, but we were sending a lot back to France.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in this earliest period, we're not getting much into the international shipping of them, but starting out, like I said, there is hugely popular food. I mean, think about how we have hot dog carts and pretzel carts and stuff. New York City, they had oyster carts. Literally, there would be guys with barrels and baskets of oysters on street corners throughout Manhattan, selling them as street food. It was hugely popular. And so
that's awesome. That's awesome.
As that,
oh my God, that's great.
It's actually, on that note, the cardboard Chinese food containers that you can get. The original patent for that was actually from an oyster seller. They would, these street vendors would put oysters in those before they were adopted by Chinese immigrants and started to be used in that cuisine.
That's pretty interesting.
But yeah, I unfortunately don't know the name of the individual who had the patent, but yeah, that's actually where that started out.
That's got to go on the bottom of a Snapple top. You know what I'm saying? Like, who invented? That's awesome.
But yeah, so as those beds there's more pressure on those New York beds, more interest to the Long Island beds. You start getting more attention coming to this industry, and the Dutch, who are already involved in the city, as they were out there, you start getting some Dutch communities on the South Shore. Particularly, you see Cornelius de Waal and Cornelius de Hague. They are two families that came through New York, immigrating from the Netherlands, and the intention going further west, going like Michigan area, but they came from an area in the Netherlands that was very involved in the shellfishing industry there. And they basically came in, heard about this burgeoning industry on the island, and came out to the Sayville area and settled there, and are kind of the start of that big Dutch Dutch oystering community that built up out there. And they get very involved. You see a lot of them as baymen, which is the guys who are going out on the water harvesting the oysters. You see them working in the packing houses like that building that we have at the museum, and eventually working their way up to running these oystering companies, owning boats, getting into financial interests related to it. There's actually an oysterman's bank for a time that specialized in loans and mortgages for these Dutch families that are, families in the oyster industry, which was primarily these Dutch families. And they just get more and more involved, and going out on the water harvesting these oysters. So what does the harvesting actually look like? That's a lot of what we talk about in that exhibit. So originally, the earliest wave of it, you see like more shore harvesting. So that's just going out with just like oyster rakes in rowboats or even hand harvesting at the shore. These are practices that are pretty in line with the indigenous practices before colonization in the area. But those shallow shoreside beds get used up pretty quick and they start moving further out. That's also, while we're talking about moving further out, I can talk a little bit about the bay itself, how the Great South Bay is really a prime area for these oysters. It's just kind of a perfect storm in terms of salinity, water temperature, depth, everything like that.
Well, I'm sure the barrier beach protects the beach better than
Absolutely.
that. It keeps it that. And then the way I recall it is that we have an enormous amount of fresh water. You know, got Carmen's River, you got Connecticut State River that bring an element of fresh water in there that keeps that equilibrium, or I should say the salinity for the bay, really great for the young, or they call it seed oyster,
Right.
for it to start to develop. And then I do understand that the correct me if I'm wrong, that adult oysters like the saltier water.
Yes. So yeah, you have it totally right. So seed oysters prefer that lower salinity. It helps them to get set up better. So the oyster is what's called sessile. Like it stays in place for its entire life once it firms up, once it, nests, basically. It finds its spot that it's going to live, and it's going to live there forever. It does not move. That's true for the adult oyster. The seed oyster does move around. So basically the oyster reproduces, they release their reproductive cells into the water that basically float around and will meet up with each other and create these seed oysters that go through the water column until they eventually find that place that they want to firm up. And like you said, those seed oysters, they like a little bit lower salinity. It helps them to develop better. And then as the oyster matures, it likes a higher salinity. So you actually see the seed oysters are more dominant in the eastern part of the bay in this early period, that 1800s, mid 1800s kind of period. The eastern bay has a little bit of that lower salinity. There's more river drain off in that area.
Okay.
And then the western part of the bay has the bigger population of the adult mature oysters.
Now, I'm just going to interrupt. Did the
absolutely.
Dutch really bring in oyster farming to the Great South Bay? Because the way I understood it was that they would take the seed and they'd move it, which really was the beginnings of some sort of farming. So, today I think of farming as the guys out in the bay and they got either surface or bottom farming, which we'll get into that in later episodes. But I didn't realize that farming of oysters has been here for almost 200 years.
Yeah, so that sort of minimal intervention level of farming, absolutely, that's a practice that goes back a long way. And the Dutch would have been practicing that in the Netherlands and bringing that knowledge into it here as well.
Nice.
And that really helps stimulate these beds, and it allows the industry to far outpace what the natural beds would be producing. By doing that, they basically help the population along and bring them through ideal conditions. And until you get into the more advanced farming today, there's a lot that you can manipulate just through the natural process of the oyster. Like their reproduction is based on the temperature of the water largely.
Yes. Yep.
So by adjusting what water they're in, what water temperature, you can see practices like that then that have become more advanced now. But yeah, so
it's right. The water temperature for them to spawn is about 68 degrees.
I don't know exact numbers on the
way I understood
it
is that I talked to a couple of biologists and they said that the water spawning is about 68 degrees. So eating cold water lobsters, cold water oysters, or believe it or not, eating oysters in winter months creates a better, how do I say this? A better tasting, thicker, more filling, plump oyster than in the water.
Yeah,
weathers.
so I can touch on that, of this idea of oystering as a cold weather industry and as a cold weather delicacy, if you will. So yeah, the general rule, the adage is that months that have an R in them is when you want oysters. So the season is September to April, and your best oysters are in the middle of that in the winter. December, January, February is like peak oyster season, because when they're spawning, which, like we said, as that water temperature goes up, that's going to prompt the oyster to spawn in its reproductive season. And the meat gets a bit watery, and it's just not as strong as flavor, not as firm in texture, and just doesn't make for as good of an oyster. You also don't want to be harvesting while it's in the spawning season, because that's going to impact your next season's harvest. There's going to be a lot less. It's the same concept of like when you look at deer hunters not going after does in mating season, because you don't want to hurt the population the next time around.
Yep.
On top of the fact that the oyster is just not that good if you eat it in that time.
No, seriously. And that's one of the things that the Shucking Truck's trying to educate people on. I am crazy busy, and we're synonymous of backyard barbecues and raw bars and clam bakes all summer long. And water temperature has everything to do with it. Totally. I try to convince people that some oysters coming out of Prince Edward's Island, which is located up in northern Canada, that some of those oysters are the finest oysters in the world, because their spawning season is so long, but they're so cold that they're just like, they have an unbelievable flavor. So that's one of the things that I'd love to see us do, more oyster events in the winter. Yeah. Maybe a roast oyster, which would be something more in parallel to the indigenous people of Long Island. They used to roast oysters all the time because they really didn't have the mechanisms to open them. And if you ever open an oyster, which is a whole different episode, it's completely different. It really is.
Yeah.
But talk about, if you could, like the harvesting. You were going to get into harvesting.
Yeah.
What kind of boats did they use?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting point. So it changes over time, and we have a great diorama of this in the museum, kind of mapping this change over time, and it kind of causes and mirrors the changes in the industry a lot. So the earliest harvesting, you see a lot of like what's called a Sharpie skiff. Like it'll be just a one-person boat, like rowboat even, and that's more of that shore harvesting and getting a little bit into deeper water doing tongs. So shore harvesting, you see rakes, which is just like a rake you'd be using in your yard, but you're dragging it through the water so it scoops the things up off the bottom. Or doing tongs, which again, think like salad tongs, but it's like a big basket on the end of some wood.
Have you ever used them?
I've not used them personally.
I watched my grandfather use them when I was a kid. My mom's father, John Frazier, he was an unbelievable guy. He was always on the bay. He was always going to Davis Park, and he always had. I thought they were archaic in nature, and they looked like these big wire baskets, and they're about this wide. And he would stick them in there, and he would. I got to be honest with you. I just need people to understand, harvesting any type of shellfish, whether it be clams, oysters, lobsters, is stupid hard work.
Oh, it is backbreaking labor. Yeah, these guys.
I have utmost respect for the people that do farming and the people that go wild, oystering and, they catch wild versus the farm. I go, the amount of strength that you need. And again, I don't know if younger people would want to do that. Like, it's hard work.
Yeah, for sure. And that is, like I said, how that industry starts out. And you can see baymen, which is to say the people who are actually on the bay doing the harvesting.
Yep.
In terms of jobs you could have at the time, definitely hard work, but their compensation was not the worst. You can get an idea of the kind of way that these people lived. One of the other exhibits we have at the museum is a bayman's cottage. It was the home of a bayman and his family, built in 1890. It gives you the kind of idea of how they were living. You're certainly not wealthy, but you're not destitute either, generally, working as a bayman, but it is for sure tough work. So that's the earliest stages of it. And then from there, you move up to the catboat. So now you're getting into sail-powered boats. You're getting a little bit deeper. And then you could still be crews going out doing tong and doing raking. But you also start to see, this becomes bigger at the next step, but the earliest parts of it you see at the catboat is the dredges. So that's going to be a net with basically a rake attached to the front of it that's going to be dragged behind the boat and just run along the shore. And it's scooping up everything. You bring it up on the deck, you dump it out, you go through, find your good oysters, push the other stuff back in. And your catboats usually have a few people on a crew of that. It could be 3, it could be 6, anywhere around there. Then you start getting to the sloop. So this is where this industry is really blowing up. This is like 1870s and onward. Is the oyster sloop. These, you can have anywhere from 5 to 13 guys. This is when the dredge is really the main thing. You're not seeing a lot of tonging once you get to sloops. Still tough. It's kind of slow going because if you go too fast, if you're catching too much wind in your sails, the net's just going to lift up off the bottom that you're towing behind you. So they're going usually like 2 to 4 knots in a straight line and going with the wind, but it's definitely increasing what they're doing. I have some numbers here on, so hand tongs typically bringing up 15 to 75 bushels a day with a crew going out on either skiffs or catboats doing tonging. When you get to dredging on these sloops, we're looking at 100 to 400 bushels in a day. And so,
wow,
huge increase. Still tough labor. They're still hauling these nets and everything. And this is also, as the sloop becomes more popular, this is also when you start seeing the consolidation of the oyster industry. So early on, 1850s, 60s, 70s, even into the 1880s, you're seeing a lot of independent baymen. So it's a lot of people who have a boat or a few guys who pool together some resources and build or buy a boat, and they're going out and they're catching oysters, and then they'll contract with these processing houses, or not so much contract as just sell their catch to these processing houses. That's the kind of building like we have at the museum. And these buildings would be all over the South Shore in this period. And you would basically, these guys would go out and bring up all this catch and then go to these houses, sell it to them. And then at the processing house, they would then clean them, size them, and either pack them in the shell or shuck them, open them, and then process that, whether it's smoking it or just canning it and pasteurize, and go through those processes. As the sloop is becoming more popular, you get through the latter half of the 19th century there, you see consolidation. You see people like Jacob Ockers, William Rudolph. These guys are wealthy individuals who either owned packing houses or were involved in, like, say, like that Oysterman's Bank that I mentioned earlier. Those kinds of industries. They start buying up other packing houses. They start leasing bottom rights to parts of the bay, if not the whole bay. Eventually, you see with Ockers is really the big guy who does it. And increasingly, it becomes not so much independent oystermen as much as people who are then employed by these like oyster magnates in the area, and they're working for them. And those guys then also own the packing houses and kind of consolidate that whole industry. And then as that's going on, once you get into the 1900s, then you start getting engines in these boats, whether it's, steam engines initially, eventually moving on to, diesel power and everything like that. And this is when things really start picking up. And these boats can now run multiple dredges at the same time. So typically on the sloops, you would see one dredge, maybe 2 dredges. On these oyster steamers, you could have 3 or 4 dredges going, and you don't need to rely on the wind anymore. So you can go back and forth over this same area. And at this point, so remember we said the sloop with the dredge is doing 100 to 400 bushels in a day. When you get to the steam dredge, they're doing 1,000 or so in about 5 hours. So you have it in a day, they're doing a whole season of what you would have been doing when you were doing just tongs.
Wow.
So it
decimated.
Yeah, it's huge. So that's one of the biggest factors. These technological advancements, obviously, way over harvesting. And at the same time, the Blue Point oyster is becoming more and more popular. Like you said, that Blue Point oyster becomes kind of famous. It's only between Bayshore and Patchogue. It's 1909, actually. New York, it's either New York State or Suffolk County, passes a law that in order to be a Blue Point oyster, it has to have spent at least 3 months in the waters of the Great South Bay belonging to Suffolk County. So
I think that's Suffolk County law. I think the state gave it the permission for that, for Suffolk County. They, if I'm not mistaken, I think you're right on that.
I believe that is the...
But it's crazy to think how many people were harvesting and how much oysters were actually physically coming out of there. And I can't help to think, look at the problems that we have with overpopulation, our food. Listen, I'm not trying to make this at all a political show, but how many times do we sit back and see how many more, string beans can we yield off of a plant, or how heavier can we make a chicken or a cow to feed more people as one bird, right? And get a return on investment. And then when does it become negative to our own means? Like when does it happen? And it really did destroy the oysters of the Great South Bay.
So I'll get into that, but there's just to touch a little bit on the packing houses. So that's the harvesting of it and starts to decline there. But when they're coming up, so then, like I've said a few times, they're going to these processing houses. So these are where the oysters are getting cleaned, sized, opened, like I was saying. And these are guys working pretty much sunrise to sundown through the coldest months of the year. Wood burning stove, keeping them warm in quotes there.
Can you imagine standing out on a day like this, right? We're going to get snow this weekend, right?
Yeah.
Think about it. You're standing outside. If you've never shucked an oyster, listen, I shuck them. I can shuck pretty good, okay? Can you imagine, right? They're all cold. These little suckers are coming out of the water. They're already like little ice cubes. Think about the technology of gloves and this, and you got a knife and you're trying to pop these puppies, right? Mm-hmm. And you're trying to put them and process them, or you're doing whatever you got to do with them. And it's cold.
Yeah.
It's cold. So, Garen, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just envision, when, like, just last night, I opened up a couple of 100 oysters for a party, and I'm thinking, oh my God, could you imagine standing there 8-10 hours a day popping oysters or roasting them or whatever, processing them?
And keeping in mind, we're talking 100 years ago, it's even colder back then.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. We don't have man's imprint.
Footprint exactly. There. And so these guys are going through, and they're either just cleaning them up and sizing them, putting them in the shell, and those are getting loaded into barrels. At first, in the early days, these are just going on wagons and either going to local markets around here, or a lot of them are going on wagons into the city to the fish markets there. Eventually, 1870s, you get the Long Island Railroad makes its way out to Sayville. So that's a huge boon to the industry. They're able to start loading them onto trains. You could start moving them way more, and they're packing barrels with either live oysters in the shell still, or, like I said, the shuckers are opening them up, taking that meat out, processing it, and that can be sent all over. So once you get to trains, still going into the city, some of them are then going even further out into like Chicago, St. Louis, anything like that. And as you had mentioned a little bit earlier, international fame. So in the late 1870s, European oyster beds are also on the decline, and the popularity of the Blue Point oyster is on the rise at the same time, and starts growing over there. And technology's getting to the point where we can start shipping them overseas.
Right.
And I don't know if you know this, Queen Victoria, when she ruled England, had a decree that the only oysters that could be served at Buckingham Palace were Blue Point oysters.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
Yep.
That's it. I didn't know that. That's a pretty cool fact.
So they're sending them out there, and there's just tons and tons of oysters being processed through these places. There's a New York Times article from 1870 that estimates wholesale the industry to be about coming out of the Sayville, Patchogue, that stretch there.
Area.
Yeah. The oyster industry would be wholesale about $5 million in 1870. And getting to the retail side, about $12 million in oysters nationwide. And again, that's in 1870 money, when you're getting paid 50 cents a day for the work. So you can only imagine what that scales up to with inflation today.
I can't. Listen, I'm going to change the subject. You might not answer this. I know clams, because you're talking so much about oysters, and I never knew this. Like, how clams have a little neck, a top neck. They have a cherry stone, they have a chowder. So are oysters categorized into certain sizes like that? Would you know of?
To my understanding, not based on size. So there is a size categorizing of oysters, but in terms of like being served, it's typically they'll have different names based on most of it today coming from farming, and so the oyster farmers have names for like basically different cultivars of oyster.
Right. Yeah.
But you do have sizing. So like the guys who were working in these processing houses, they would be going through sizes that are named. Like they have box, medium, small, and half shell were the sizes that these guys would go through. So they would be standing at these workbenches and have either like trays with a certain gauge, basically holes in the trays.
Right.
And so that ones that are
A culling rack.
Exactly.
Clams culling racks. They look like they look like little grates, right? Like big grates, and you throw your clams on, and you kind of shake them. Whatever falls through, depending on the size, would go to a specific bag. And I'm assuming that the oysters would have done the same
yes,
thing.
Exactly that. And so that's how these guys would do that, or they would just have hand gauges, which would basically look kind of like a wrench, like an open, like a plumber's wrench sort of thing, and just see if it fits the size of the oyster. So one of those two tools they would use, and they would put them into their labeled barrels for box, medium, small, half shell.
See, when I did lobstering, see the life and trial and tribulations of Ralph, right? I did lobstering. We used to, I think it was like 3.5. You used to have a gauge, and you used to measure it from the eye socket, the back of the eye socket to the back of the shell. And if you couldn't get it on,
right,
that means that the lobster was old enough you could harvest it. If it went on smoothly or it had any gap in it, needed another molt or two, and you would have to throw it back.
Yeah, so same kind of idea there, except they're not throwing them back. They're just putting them in different barrels.
That's exactly it. So that's pretty interesting. So you have a boat over at the Sayville Museum.
Yeah, so we have Priscilla. She's an 1888 oyster sloop. She's actually the only still sailing boat from the Great South Bay Oyster Fleet, which was one of those fleets operated by these oyster magnates, like I called them. We actually just finished a huge restoration on her. So the last restoration that she had to this scale was back in like 2002, 2003. So it's been a little over 20 years. And about every 20 years, the nature of wood boats, you just got to put in a lot of work. So this was a huge undertaking, ran from just about October 24 to October 25. So we had no sailing season on her last year. We got new mast, new decking, total refitting of every fastener on the boat. We had guys under there in the middle of winter pulling out all of the old screws, putting new ones in, sealing everything up. So it was a huge undertaking. But yeah, like I said, she is an oyster sloop. We don't do any oystering on her anymore, but she is that kind of boat that was used for this sort of stuff.
Well, you said she's still sailing. So, yes. I mean, what do you do? Like, you just keep her in the water and you just take her out every now and then? Or
so we have, through the sailing season, we do public sails, public tours on her, basically. So it's a 2-hour sail. In the winter, she's docked over at the museum. You can come down and check her out right now. Wear a jacket. It's chilly with the wind coming off the bay. I bet. But you can come see the boat. And then usually from June into like the beginning of October, we run sails Tuesday through Sunday, and you go out for 2 hours. We have captains who take you along the South Bay. The crew are all volunteers who just love being on the water, love the boat, love the museum. And come and check it out. They take you around around the South Bay. The captain gives you a little bit of the history about the boat, about what it would have been used for, about what went into restoration, everything like that. So yeah, I mean, if anybody's interested in that, is give a call to the museum. We usually start opening up our sailing season in like March or so to start scheduling for it. She's a National Historic Landmark, so she's a piece of history that you can come and check out, and it's a passion project for a lot of the people involved in the museum. And if you're interested in what I've been talking about here, the oyster industry, it's really you get an experience of it that you really can't get anywhere else.
Sidebar, I shouldn't even be asked this. Do you ever offer any programs? The thing that freaks me out is that I was a teacher at Lindenhurst for 30 plus years. And the thing that I always believe that we should have a class, because Lindenhurst is right on the South Shore. It's got more nooks and crannies and marinas than you can count. I never understood why the high school never ran a marine program. And I meant marine engine repair, boat. I don't know what the true name of the craft was, but to possibly ever pursue an internship with Sayville or a couple of the other neighboring schools to start teaching some of this lost trade. There's tons of kids in high school today that, don't want to go to college. And this sounds crazy. I really believe in the vocation. Like I believe that some kids should go to college and some kids can go to work. And there's nothing wrong with it. They're both noble professions. But to give an opportunity to bring kids to do like small engine repair, like marine outboard engine repair. You can't find people to do it anymore. And it might be something that might benefit the program to get grant money to do things of that nature.
So we don't have anything like that. We don't do much in terms of like engine work just because we're mostly focused wood boats, sailing boats is a lot of what we do. We have worked in the past. We've had some programs with some BOCES students who have come and worked with our boat shops and gotten experience with that and have gone on to,
awesome.
build their own boats and stuff like that. And I know that I've organized some tours with a few schools that have like maritime history courses or like different marine studies kinds of things. So I've done tours for like marine bio programs, maritime history programs from a few high schools all across the island, which has been cool. But I haven't seen anybody that does like specifically in the marine engine area. And like I said, that is kind of outside of our purview. But I mean, it is definitely an interesting opportunity that would be cool to see a museum somewhere get into. There's plenty of other museums that do this kind of stuff, whether it's, Mystic up in Connecticut or anything like that. So I don't know if they've gotten into programs, but definitely something interesting that'll be cool to see an institution look into.
Okay.
But yeah, going back to the oyster stuff, really, we're getting towards the end here. So wrap up the, as I've alluded to a couple times, that industry falls off. We talked about the over harvesting, how much they're taking out of there. And you also see through the first half of the 1900s, you see the big rise in Long Island duck farms. And that leads to a lot more agricultural runoff into the water. So that's a big factor into impacting the oyster population.
Like pollution.
Right. Like we talked about them being filter feeders. So when they're filtering everything out of the water, when you have agricultural runoff and you have pesticides and stuff like that that are being used on farms that are getting into the water, you have certain elements that the oyster can't digest that are harmful to the oyster that it's going to be filtering out alongside all the stuff that it does need to live. And that's going to cause some of them to die off. You also, on top of these, in fact, you have climate change starting to set in as those water temperatures rise. That impacts the spawning season as well. So that hurts the populations. And all of these factors are going on. And then we have 1938, huge hurricane comes through, which is just massive. One of the biggest hurricanes to ever hit the island. It's actually before we were naming hurricanes. So it's just the hurricane of 1938, which I always find kind of funny. But that storm surge washes over Fire Island and comes into the Great South Bay. It opens up new inlets into the bay, destroys some others, which throws off the salinity. It brings in all of this storm surge and muck and sediment that buries a lot of the oyster beds. So oysters have to sit on top of the seafloor in order to breathe, unlike clams that dig in. An oyster gets buried, it'll die. And so the industry is already struggling from these other factors. And then that comes through and kind of is like the nail in the coffin.
Perfect
hitting
storm.
them. Yep. And those populations just drop off. The industry still goes into the 40s, but it cannot recover anywhere close to those levels from before. And even today, when you look at actual like oyster harvesting, not oyster farming, it looks like that 1700s we were talking about, one guy in a boat by himself with a pair of tongs. Like there is just not that industrial commercial oystering anymore. There are projects going on to try to bring back oysters in the Great South Bay. There's at the county level and even at the state level, there are like granting programs for people. If you have property on the water that's good for oysters, that is good environment for them, you can get seed oysters to try to develop your own oyster beds. And these programs are still pretty young in the grand scheme of things, but the early results are good. There's been some progress on it. So hopefully we can see that population start to come up because like we said, they're so important for the environment. Also, I mean, we all want to keep eating them, right?
Sure. But who doesn't? Who doesn't? But you got to have them to eat them. So that's it.
Yeah.
But no, you're right. There's a lot of programs. I know Southampton, I don't know if it was the Cornell Extension would give you out 100 seeds or 500 seeds, and they give you a car, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you put your seeds in there and you go out and you maintain them year after year and you go out and you tumble them.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, I don't know if it was you got half to eat and then you donated half to the spawning process.
There's a few different programs that work a little different, but that, things along that line is basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. So wrapping up, tell me why should people come to the museum? Tell me, what does the museum have to offer to people?
Yes, I mean, we have 5 different exhibits. Well, 4 exhibit spaces plus our volunteer boat shop is our 5th space. In all historic buildings, it's a lot about, I mean, if anything I said here is interesting to you, you should definitely come check out the processing house, the packing house that I was talking about. We have over 30 historic wood vessels on display down there. We have our Bayman's Cottage that I alluded to a little bit. And in our main building, we have a rotating front gallery. That's where actually just today we have an art exhibit that's coming down that was actually from the restoration of Priscilla art made out of her old mast. But,
really?
Yeah,
that's awesome.
So that was a temporary exhibit that's just wrapping up now. And so we have rotating exhibits there. We have a gallery on the U.S. Life-Saving Service, which is the predecessor to the Coast Guard. So we really have a lot of very much like late 1800s, early 1900s maritime history on Long Island. And obviously maritime history is so important to Long Island. And even beyond that, we do all kinds of programming. So we have a lecture series that'll be starting up in a few weeks. We do a winter lecture series every year on Sundays. We have that coming up. And if you like eating oysters, then of course we have our seafood festival. Anybody who lives anywhere in the area, I'm sure you've heard about it. You've probably been impacted by the traffic changes from it.
Without a doubt.
We have, it's a 2-day festival we do in August, usually like second to last weekend of August. And that's just all kinds of, different food vendors. We usually partner with like Claw's Seafood Market, which is over in West Sayville as well. And along with some other, local businesses and everything. And we have arts and crafts vendors. There's live music. And it's just a great way to come and get involved with the community, eat some seafood, eat some oysters.
That's what you're supposed to do. And I'm glad you use everybody local. Claus does a great job. They have outstanding seafood. I'm glad that, it's keeping Sayville in Sayville, because that's really what you should be doing. Although it's all of Long Island, it's great to see that, and I've said it again, there's tons of great people out there doing and using of oysters. I don't want anybody to think that, I'm it and there's nobody else. There's a lot of great people that I still learn from. There really is. So it's a blessing to be in this industry. And you think it's a big industry, and then you realize like everybody knows everybody. Right. It's going back to episode 1, it's our own family. There's only a handful of people. There is very rare that you're not talking to somebody and, oh yeah, I know. And it's like, you don't even get 6 degrees of separation. It's actually 1. So, well, Justin, thank you for coming on. Listen,
thanks so much for having me.
I really do appreciate it. I love the fact that as a history teacher, this is what I live for. I relish in it. Mrs. Scanlon, who was a social studies teacher at Bellport, she was my Long Island history teacher, and she really did teach a lot about this. She had just passed last year, and she was an amazing woman. I hadn't seen her in years. I just saw it posted, but she was a resident of Quogue. She ran the Historical Society out in Quogue, so she was an awesome woman. So, there's something a little bit about today that I'm thinking of Mrs. Scanlon, Joan Scanlon. So, but other than that, guys, listen, again, I want to thank you for everything. I thank you for chiming in. I hope this was informative. I really want you to understand how important the oyster was to Long Island. I mean, we look at it again as an end user, we miss the layers. And take your kids out. Let them understand the world that they live around. Again, I know I'm harping on family and food, and that's really going to be my motto. That's it. That's my entire goal, that if you can understand how something gets to somebody, and that's what's important. When you're eating an oyster, I don't care where you eat it. You got to think about a couple of things. That person outside pulling those traps or digging them wild, the person that has to process them, the refrigeration process, getting you to market, the end user, it goes through 5, 6, 7 hands. And the most important hand of all is Mother Nature. So you really have to sit back and say to yourself that these are a really incredible little animal. I guess as an animal would be a proper, an animal would be a great term for it, right? But try them, go out and try them. If you're not a raw person, don't eat them raw. Have them roasted, have them steamed, throw them in a chowder. Again, one of Ben Franklin's favorite food was, cider and oysters. He loved oyster stew, and it was probably the contributing factor to him having gout Like, he really could move around. He had a cart that people would carry him around because he couldn't walk, but he would never short for oysters. So I really do thank you. I appreciate it. We're going to continue to do some of this stuff. We've got hopefully some excellent more episodes coming up. Thank you for following me. I hope to see you, or at least talk to you again. This is Ralph Pagano, Long Island Chuck and Truck. Take care. Have a great day. Thank you.